There's a video right now claiming that artificial intelligence just reconstructed an entirely lost chapter of the Bible, leaving scholars speechless, unable to explain what the machine had somehow uncovered. That specific framing, a lost chapter, magically reconstructed, scholars rendered speechless, does not hold up to scrutiny. And there is no verifiable published study behind that exact dramatic claim. Search for it directly and you find the same familiar pattern already seen across other viral AI archaeology and history videos: confident narration, dramatic music, and no named researcher, no linkable publication, and no verifiable institution actually standing behind the specific claim being made. But buried underneath that manufactured headline sits something genuinely real, genuinely published, and honestly far more interesting than any fabricated lost chapter story could ever be. In June of 2025, a team of researchers spanning archaeology, biblical studies, physics, mathematics, and computer science actually did publish a peer-reviewed study in the scientific journal PLOS One, describing a novel AI-powered statistical model built specifically to analyze the authorship of biblical texts. And what that real research uncovered has genuinely significant implications for one of the oldest, most contested questions in the entire field of biblical scholarship: who actually wrote the first 9 books of the Hebrew Bible, and how many different hands were actually involved in shaping the text we read today. Stick around, because the real story here does not need a single invented detail to be worth your full attention. To understand why this study actually matters, you first need to understand the specific scholarly puzzle researchers have been wrestling with for well over 2 centuries. For most of religious history, the traditional assumption held that the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, known collectively as the Torah or the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, were composed by a single author, traditionally identified as Moses himself. Starting in the 18th and 19th centuries, however, biblical scholars working within a discipline known as source criticism began noticing something textually significant: recurring inconsistencies, shifting divine names, duplicated narratives, told with slightly different details, and distinct, recognizable differences in vocabulary and style occurring at different points throughout these same books. This observation eventually developed into what became known as the documentary hypothesis, the proposal that the Torah was not composed by one single author working alone, but rather compiled and edited together over an extended period of time from multiple separate underlying source traditions, each with its own distinct authorial voice, vocabulary, and theological perspective. Scholars typically labeled these hypothesized underlying sources using letters, most commonly the Deuteronomistic source, associated primarily with the Book of Deuteronomy, and the priestly source, associated with rituals, genealogies, and priestly regulations scattered throughout several other books. A closely related, similarly extensive body of text, stretching from the Book of Joshua through Kings and known as the Deuteronomistic history, has separately long been associated stylistically with that same Deuteronomistic tradition found in Deuteronomy itself. For more than 200 years, scholars have debated and refined this general framework almost entirely through traditional, painstaking, purely human methods: close reading, careful comparison of vocabulary and grammar, and detailed analysis of narrative structure and theological emphasis. This approach has produced enormously valuable insight, but it inevitably carries a significant degree of subjectivity and scholarly disagreement built directly into the process, since reasonable, well-trained researchers, all working from precisely the same underlying text, can and frequently do draw somewhat different conclusions about exactly where one hypothesized source ends and another begins. This is precisely the gap the 2025 research team set out to address, not by replacing careful traditional scholarship, but by building a genuinely rigorous, mathematically grounded tool capable of supplementing it. The research team behind this actual study included Shira Feigenbaum-Golovin, an assistant research professor of Mathematics S at Duke University, Alon Kipnis of Reichman University, Axel Buhler of the Protestant Faculty of Theology in Paris, Eli Piasecki of Tel Aviv University, Thomas Romer, a widely respected biblical scholar affiliated with the Collège de France, and Israel Finkelstein, head of the School of Archaeology and Maritime Cultures at the University of Haifa, one of the most prominent and frequently cited biblical archaeologists working today. This was, notably, not the first collaboration between several of these same researchers. Feigenbaum-Golovin and Finkelstein had previously worked together, starting around 2010, applying mathematical and statistical tools to determine likely authorship patterns among ancient Hebrew inscriptions found on pottery fragments dating to around 600 BC. Work significant enough at the time that it was covered on the front page of the New York Times. That earlier project on Physica L inscriptions eventually planted the seed for this considerably more ambitious follow-up effort, this time directed specifically at the biblical text itself. The actual technical method, the team developed centers on something called word frequency analysis, examining subtle, often genuinely unconscious patterns in how frequently specific words, or short sequences of words that researchers refer to using the technical term n-grams, appear across different sections of text. The underlying premise draws directly on a well-established idea already used successfully in other fields of authorship analysis entirely outside of new biblical studies, the notion that every writer, whether consciously or not, tends to develop distinctive, measurable habits in how frequently they reach for certain everyday, seemingly unremarkable words, terms as ordinary and easily overlooked as not, which, or king. These small, habitual word choices function almost like a stylistic fingerprint, one that tends to remain remarkably consistent for an individual author or a specific scribal school, even when that same author or school is writing about entirely different subject matter. Crucially, and this point matters enormously for understanding why the method works as well as it apparently does, these particular linguistic patterns tend to sit well below the level of conscious authorial intention, meaning they are considerably harder for a writer to deliberately manipulate or disguise compared to more obvious features like specific vocabulary choices tied directly to subject matter or ideology. To build and properly validate their model, the research team first trained it using chapters where scholarly consensus regarding authorship was already relatively well established and broadly agreed upon within the field, essentially teaching the statistical model what each of the three major writing traditions, the Deuteronomistic source, the Deuteronomistic history, and the priestly source, actually looked like in measurable, quantifiable linguistic terms. Once properly trained on that already agreed upon material, the team then tested their model against 50 separate chapters specifically selected because scholars had already independently assigned each one to one of those three writing traditions through traditional means, checking whether the AI-powered statistical model would arrive at matching conclusions purely through its own independent mathematical analysis. According to the published results, the model's classifications lined up closely with existing scholarly consensus, correctly identifying, for example, that the Deuteronomistic source and the Deuteronomistic history shared closer stylistic similarity to each other than either one shared with the separate priestly writing tradition, a finding that itself matched what traditional biblical scholarship had already broadly concluded through entirely different, non-computational methods. Researcher Alon Kipnis specifically highlighted one particularly valuable feature built directly into their approach, noting that the method's real strength lies in its ability to explain its own conclusions by pointing directly to the specific words or expressions that led it to classify any particular chapter a certain way, rather than functioning as an opaque black box producing conclusions with no accompanying checkable justification. Once that initial validation was complete, the team applied their newly tested model to additional chapters throughout the broad R body of text, sometimes referred to by scholars as the Enneatosh, meaning the first 9 books of the Hebrew Bible taken, together as a connected whole, systematically working through material where scholarly consensus regarding precise authorship remained considerably less settled or more actively disputed. This is where the research produced what is arguably its single most genuinely striking and scholarly significant finding. When the model was applied to a specific section of text found within the Book of Samuel, known among biblical scholars as the Ark narrative, describing the capture and subsequent return of the Ark of the Covenant, portions of that particular narrative did not clearly or confidently match any of the 3 primary writing styles the model had already learned to reliably identify elsewhere throughout the text. This unexpected result suggests the plausible presence of an additional, previously unidentified authorial layer or distinct underlying tradition embedded within that specific narrative, one that traditional scholarly analysis had not previously isolated or clearly recognized as textually distinct from the surrounding material. It is genuinely important to be precise and appropriately careful here about exactly what a finding like this does and does not actually establish, since overstating a result like this would represent exactly the kind of sensationalism the more fabricated viral videos on this same general topic regularly traffic in, the model flagging a specific stylistic mismatch within the Ark narrative. It does not, by itself, definitively prove the existence of some brand new, previously entirely unknown source or scribal tradition. What it does provide is a rigorous, mathematically grounded, and genuinely testable signal, one worth further dedicated scholarly investigation using both computational and traditional textual methods, working carefully together in tandem. Thomas Romer, one of the study's co-authors and a widely respected biblical scholar in his own right, was notably careful to frame the study's broader significance with appropriate scholarly caution when speaking to press following its publication, explicitly reminding readers that there are, properly speaking, no single individual authors of biblical texts in any modern sense of that term at all. As Romer put it directly, the original underlying versions of these ancient scrolls were continuously reworked and rewritten over an extended period by generations of redactors and editors who variously added, altered, and at times even omitted specific portions of the earlier existing text, as it continued to be copied and transmitted across many successive generations. In other words, even this genuinely real, carefully validated AI-powered research is not claiming to have identified individual named human authors in anything resembling the modern sense of that word. It is instead offering a considerably more precise, more rigorously quantified way of mapping and distinguishing between broader scribal traditions and writing schools, tools and communities of writers working across an extended span of historical time, gradually shaping and reshaping the text through a long, layered process of composition, editing, and transmission. It is worth walking through, in a bit more technical detail, exactly what kind of statistical machinery actually powers this method, since understanding the mechanics helps make clear why researchers trust its outputs considerably more than a vague, unexplained AI black box would ever deserve. The team's approach drew on a specific statistical technique known as higher criticism thresholding, a method originally developed for entirely different applications, including tasks like distinguishing meaningful genetic signals from background biological noise and previously applied in unrelated fields, such as detecting authorship patterns in disputed historical documents, and even identifying automated fake news accounts on social media platforms. Applied here, the technique works by systematically identifying which specific words or short word sequences show the most statistically significant, most reliably distinctive frequency differences between the various writing traditions being compared, effectively filtering out ordinary, expected background variation in word choice to isolate the comparatively rare, unusually strong stylistic signals that most reliably distinguish one scribal tradition from another. This is a well-established, previously validated statistical approach being thoughtfully and carefully adapted to a genuinely new application, rather than some kind of mysterious, unprecedented computational leap invented from scratch specifically for this one particular study. The broader publication itself also went well beyond simply announcing a single, isolated, finding about the arc narrative. The complete underlying data set the team used to train and test their model has been made openly available through the Duke Research Data Repository, a formal academic archive specifically designed to allow other qualified researchers around the world to access, scrutinize, and potentially attempt to independently replicate the exact same analysis for themselves. This kind of open, transparent data sharing represents another meaningful marker distinguishing genuine, credible scientific research from vague, unverifiable viral claims. Anyone reasonably skeptical of the study's specific conclusions does not simply have to take the research team's word for it. They can, at least in principle, go examine the same underlying dataset directly and attempt to work through the analysis themselves, an option that simply does not exist for viral videos built entirely around unnamed AI systems and unspecified, unpublished scans. The study's publication also generated meaningful, thoughtful discussion within the broader community of professional biblical scholars, some of it genuinely critical and appropriately cautious in exactly the way legitimate academic discourse tends to be. Coverage in the Times of Israel specifically noted that this pioneering new algorithmic approach might, in the words of that publication, shatter scholarly certitude regarding some long-standing, previously comfortable assumptions about the exact boundaries between different underlying source traditions, while also being careful to note that computational tools like this one are best understood as offering additional, valuable evidence to be carefully weighed alongside existing traditional scholarship, rather than serving as some kind of final, infallible word capable of settling every remaining open question in the field all on its own. This kind of measured, appropriately qualified reception, enthusiasm about a genuinely valuable new tool combined with realistic acknowledgement of the tool's inherent limitations, is precisely the sort of response one would expect and hope for following an illegitimate, carefully conducted scientific advance. A meaningfully different tone entirely from the breathless, uncritical astonishment typically manufactured by viral clickbait content built around vague, unverifiable claims. There is something genuinely valuable and worth appreciating about how carefully this particular research team handled the broader question of what their AI model could, and importantly could not, actually claim to have accomplished. Unlike the manufactured viral videos claiming dramatic, unexplainable AI reveals about lost biblical chapters, this real published study explicitly positioned its computational method as a tool meant to supplement and rigorously test existing traditional scholarship, not to replace or overturn it through some kind of mysterious, unexplainable computational leap. The model's outputs were specifically designed to be interpretable and checkable by human researchers, capable of pointing directly to the specific linguistic evidence supporting any given classification, rather than functioning as an opaque, unexplainable oracle whose conclusions simply had to be accepted purely on faith. This transparency stands in sharp, telling contrast to the vague, unverifiable claims found throughout so much viral AI content currently circulating online. Content that typically offers no actual methodology, no checkable underlying data, and no way for anyone else to meaningfully verify or challenge whatever dramatic conclusion is being presented. It is also worth pointing out that this specific 2025 study was not created in a vacuum, but instead builds directly on a broader, increasingly active trend of applying computational and statistical methods to genuinely difficult, long-standing humanities research questions across a range of entirely different fields. Feigenbaum-Golovin herself noted that this same general type of AI-driven stylistic analysis could plausibly be applied well beyond biblical studies specifically, potentially helping verify the authenticity of other historically significant documents, ranging from additional ancient texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls to disputed letters and documents attributed to major historical and political figures such as Abraham Lincoln. This broader pattern reflects a growing, genuinely exciting area of interdisciplinary research, sometimes referred to as computational stylometry, bringing together mathematics, computer science, and traditional humanities scholarship in ways that offer real, meaningfully new analytical tools without discarding or replacing the deep, contextual knowledge traditional scholars have carefully built up across many decades of dedicated study. None of this careful, methodologically rigorous, appropriately cautious research, it is worth emphasizing clearly one final time, involves anything resembling a lost chapter of the Bible being magically reconstructed by an AI system, nor does it involve scholars being left speechless or shaken by some kind of unexplainable revelation. What actually happened instead is considerably more grounded and, in its own quiet way, considerably more impressive. A carefully designed, transparent, and rigorously validated computational tool developed collaboratively by named researchers working at respected academic institutions, subjected to peer review, and published openly for any other qualified researcher in the world to examine, question, or attempt to independently replicate. That is precisely what legitimate scientific progress in this specific field actually looks like in practice. Incremental, carefully documented, appropriately cautious about its own limitations, and entirely willing to explain exactly how and why it reached whatever conclusions it managed to reach. It is worth briefly touching on one further, closely related genuine development in this same broad space, since it helps illustrate just how much real, well-documented progress is currently being made in ancient manuscript research without needing any exaggeration whatsoever. Researchers at the University of Glasgow separately announced the recovery of 42 long-lost pages from Codex H, an important early New Testament manuscript, using advanced imaging technology capable of revealing text that had become invisible to the naked eye over many centuries of wear, reuse, and physical deterioration. Manuscripts like Codex H are technically known as palimpsests, meaning the original text had, at some point centuries ago, been scraped away, and written over by later scribes seeking to reuse valuable parchment, leaving only faint, otherwise unreadable traces of the original underlying writing behind. Using specialized multispectral imaging techniques, rather than any kind of AI text generation or reconstruction, researchers were able to recover and read that original hidden text directly, uncovering previously unknown chapter divisions differing meaningfully from how these same New Testament letters are typically divided today, along with numerous scribal corrections, annotations, and margina L notes left behind by generations of later readers engaging directly with the manuscript. This represents a genuinely real, independently verifiable form of manuscript recovery, one relying on careful imaging science and dedicated collaboration between manuscript specialists, data scientists, and museum professionals, rather than any speculative AI-powered reconstruction of missing text that was never actually physically present or recoverable in the manuscript to begin with. Together, these two entirely real and independently verifiable developments, the AI-powered authorship analysis published in PLOS 1, and the imaging-based manuscript recovery work conducted at Glasgow paint a considerably more accurate, considerably more genuinely exciting picture of where ancient text research actually stands today than any single manufactured viral video ever could. If you appreciate content that separates genuinely fascinating, real scientific research from the manufactured, sensationalized version increasingly flooding social media feeds today, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, because there's plenty more of exactly this kind of deep dive still to come. The next time a video claims some artificial intelligence system just uncovered a shocking, previously unknown secret buried inside an ancient text, take a moment before sharing it and ask a few simple, practical questions. Is there a specific named research team and a specific citable published study actually attached to this particular claim? Does that published research include a clear, checkable methodology that other qualified researchers could independently attempt to replicate or challenge? And does the actual claim being made in the video line up honestly with what the underlying published research genuinely says, rather than dramatically exaggerating or fundamentally distorting a real, considerably more modest and carefully qualified finding into something it never actually claimed to be? Real, credible research on exactly this general topic does genuinely exist, published openly, cited by name, and freely available for anyone curious enough to go looking for it. It just happens to be considerably more careful, more nuanced, and admittedly less immediately dramatic than a video insisting scholars were left entirely speechless by some mysteriously reconstructed lost chapter. If topics like this genuinely interest you, real computational breakthroughs in biblical scholarship, and the manufactured myths increasingly built up around them, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because authentic research, it consistently turns out, rarely needs any exaggeration at all to already be worth your full and undivided attention.